So there I was, standing in my own office on a freezing Tuesday afternoon, watching my brother-in-law Dan sitting in my leather chair. And I don't mean just sitting in it. This guy had his muddy $300 designer boots propped right up on my mahogany desk, lazily swirling a glass of my top-shelf 12-year-old scotch like he was a movie star. 2 years ago? Man, 2 years ago I was literally carrying this exact same guy into my house in my arms because he couldn't even walk to the bathroom by himself after he wrapped his motorcycle around a dump truck. I paid for his physical therapy out of my own pocket, fed him, housed him, and practically begged my yard crew to give him a simple entry-level job on the dock so he'd stop feeling like a complete burden. And standing right next to him was my wife, Elena, holding this thick pink paper folder with a face so cold you could freeze a steak on it. On the front page of that folder was my signature, handing over 51% of Midwest Logistics LLC. Yeah, my own signature. She managed to trick me into signing it at 2 in the morning a week earlier under the guise of routine end-of-year tax forms and state license updates. I had been awake for 3 days straight fixing broken axles and dealing with winter highway pileups, so I was basically a walking zombie. I signed, where she pointed, crashed on the couch, and woke up a week later to find out I'd been legally stripped of my own life's work. They both looked at me like I was a piece of trash they'd just swept out from under the fridge, telling me point blank that I was nothing in this company anymore and that my services were no longer required. But these two geniuses, who haven't earned a single honest dollar or broken a real sweat in their entire lives, completely forgot one tiny little detail. An LLC is just a piece of paper. But the actual trucking business runs on trust, sweat, and knowing who to call when everything goes to high heaven. Look, let me back up for a second so you get the full picture. I'm 45 years old, and I spent 12 years building this freight haulage company in Milwaukee from literally zero. If you've never worked logistics in Wisconsin during the winter, count your blessings, because it's a special kind of nightmare. It's not some cool movie where you just drive a big shiny truck into the sunset. It's frozen cheese shipments, slush-covered staging yards, diesel fuel turning into thick gray jelly at 20 below zero, and me running around at 3 in the morning with a propane torch trying to thaw out air brakes so our rigs can make the morning delivery in Chicago. My ex-wife Elena always thought this was dirty, low-class work. She stayed strictly in the heated office, doing light paperwork, filing basic invoices, and talking to the outside accountant. I trusted her completely. I thought, hey, we're a team, right? She handles the papers, I handle the 30 rowdy drivers, the diesel engines, and the clients. Huge mistake. Massive. Never trust someone with the paperwork just because you share a bed with them. The whole disaster started 3 years ago when her younger brother Dan decided to play street racer on his motorcycle and lost a fight with a 10-ton construction vehicle. The guy survived by the skin of his teeth, but his spine was completely shattered. The doctors at the hospital basically told us he'd be stuck in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Elena was crying so hard she was hyperventilating, begging me to let him move into our spare room. What was I supposed to do? Say no? I'm an everyday guy, but I'm not heartless. I renovated the ground floor, hired private physical therapists, and paid every single medical bill that insurance wouldn't cover. After 2 years of hard work, the guy actually stood up and started walking again. So to get him off my couch and give him some self-respect, I made him a junior dispatcher at my yard. Did he say thank you? Did he work hard? Not a chance. The second he could walk without a cane, Dan went straight from humble patient to absolute megalomaniac. Within 3 months, he was strutting around my greasy maintenance bay in pristine $300 boots bought on our corporate credit card, talking down to veteran mechanics who'd been turning wrenches since before he was born. He started telling everyone on the dock that he was a co-owner of the business, even though he couldn't tell a refrigerated trailer from a flatbed if his life depended on it. Then came December, the absolute worst month in trucking. Between holiday shipping madness and an ice storm that flipped 2 of our rigs on the highway, I was running on gas station coffee, cheap cigarettes, and about 4 minutes of sleep a night. That was when Elena walked into my office at 2 a.m. with that pink folder, whispering sweet little lies about urgent tax deadlines, while I was practically hallucinating from exhaustion. I signed it, I didn't check page 24. And just like that, I handed the keys to the castle over to a snake and a leech. Drop a comment or tell me straight. Have you ever signed something on pure trust just because it came from family? Man, that is hands down the absolute biggest mistake a guy can make in his entire life. But stick around, because when these two geniuses decided to officially throw me out on my ear as a mere employee, they were about to hit a brick wall of pure, unadulterated reality. They thought a piece of paper made them kings of the road, but they had no idea how this game actually works. So back to that crazy Tuesday afternoon. 2 weeks after I sleepily signed that pink folder, Dan decided it was time to show the whole staging yard who the new big shot was. He spent those 14 days strutting around like he owned the entire Midwest, changing driver shifts on a whim, writing up veteran haulers for total nonsense like having dusty tires, and trying to lecture my mechanics on how to properly secure a heavy load. Old-timer guys who had been driving 16-wheelers for 20 years kept pulling me aside in the garage. My head mechanic, Bob, came up to me, wiped his greasy hands on a rag, and said, "Art, who is this clown on the dock trying to tell us how to run the shop?" I just shook my head and told him to hold his horses, thinking Dan was just getting a little over-enthusiastic about his new job. Man, I should have thrown him off the property right then and there. When the confrontation finally happened, I just stood there in front of my own desk, watching Dan take another slow sip of my expensive scotch. Elena didn't even look me in the eye when she handed me the official termination notice. She just cleared her throat, put on her best corporate voice, and said, "Art, Dan holds 51% of Midwest Logistics LLC, and I hold 49. We've appointed a new management board, and your services as general manager are no longer required. Please hand over your office keys and truck remote by 1 o'clock." I sat down in one of the wooden visitor chairs, completely stunned by the sheer level of calculation. I looked at my wife, the woman I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, and said, "Are you for real right now, Elena? I literally pulled your brother out of a wheelchair. I paid for the house you're living in. I built every single delivery route this company runs on." And you know what she said? She didn't even blink. She just adjusted her coat and said, "Business requires toughness, Art. You're stuck in the past with your old school ways. Hand over the keys." Now in the movies, when a guy gets betrayed like this, he flips the desk over, screams at the top of his lungs, and smashes a bunch of coffee mugs against the wall. But in real life, a weird, heavy silence just takes over the room. I realized right then that shouting wasn't going to change the ink on that corporate document. Suing them over the LLC name would take 3 years in court, cost $50,000 in legal fees, and by the time we finished, they would have completely ruined the business anyway. So I just took a deep breath, stood up, grabbed my personal notebook with all my direct client contacts off the shelf, and said, "All right, I wish you two the absolute best of luck in the freight business." Dan laughed, this smug, arrogant little chuckle, as I picked up my jacket. He actually thought he had just pulled off the heist of the century and grabbed a golden goose that would lay free money for the rest of his life. But if you know anything about real business, you know a factory isn't the building, it's the skilled people inside. And a trucking company isn't 3 letters on a tax document. It's the personal phone calls between the guy running the show and the plant directors who need their stuff moved before it spoils. I walked out to the parking lot, got into my trusty old Ford F-150, and pulled out onto the main road. I didn't drive home. I just pulled over onto the shoulder near the highway, took out my phone, and called my corporate attorney, Tom. "Tom," I said, "they took the LLC." Tom paused on the line for 3 long seconds. "Wait, you mean the same LLC that holds the lease on all 25 semi-trucks and the $40,000 monthly rent for the staging yard?" And right then, like a lightning bolt, the entire picture hit me. The LLC didn't actually own any real physical assets. It only owned the heavy expenses, the massive truck leases, the property rent, and the employee payroll. The actual live money didn't come from the company name. It came from the clients who trusted me to get their cargo delivered on time. I sat in my truck on the shoulder of Interstate 94, wiping steam off the driver's side window, listening to the hum of traffic and my lawyer Tom laughing through the speakerphone. Art, you realize what they actually stole from you, right? Tom said, cracking up. They didn't steal a cash cow. They stole a mountain of monthly bills. That LLC is sitting on 25 commercial truck leases with personal guarantees attached, a $40,000 monthly lease on the distribution facility, and a payroll for 30 guys. If those trucks aren't moving cargo 24/7, that company burns through $2,000 a day just sitting still. The light bulb in my head didn't just turn on. It exploded like a flare. In commercial freight, shipping managers don't care about the letters printed on the side of a trailer. They don't care if you're an LLC, an Inc., or a sole proprietorship. They care about one thing. When 30 tons of fresh Wisconsin cheese or vacuum-sealed pork chops need to be in Chicago by 4 in the morning, does the driver show up? I hung up with Tom, took a deep breath, and opened my beaten-up leather notebook. 5 years ago, before Midwest Logistics grew into a big operation, I had registered a simple sole proprietorship entity under my own name, Midwest Freight Solutions, just to handle occasional one-off hauling jobs and equipment consulting. It was fully licensed, had an active DOT number, and was completely clean. I called Bob, the regional logistics director at the biggest dairy processing plant in eastern Wisconsin. I'd known Bob for 11 years. I'd helped his team out of tight spots during blizzard season more times than I could count, personally driving rigs through whiteouts when nobody else would hit the highway. "Bob," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm calling to let you know I've officially stepped down from Midwest Logistics LLC. I'm running all my operations directly through my primary firm, Midwest Freight Solutions, starting effective immediately." Bob didn't even pause his typing on the other end of the line. "Art, I'm going to be honest with you. Your brother-in-law Dan called my office an hour ago trying to sound like a hotshot executive, and he couldn't even give me the correct gate code for our loading bay. I don't give a hoot what name is on the billing invoice, Art. I care about my cheese not sitting on a warm dock overnight. Are your drivers still going to haul my trailers tomorrow morning? Bob, if you sign an updated carrier agreement with my new firm today, I guarantee your cargo will be in Illinois before the sun comes up. Email it over right now," Bob said. "I'll have my legal department sign it within 10 minutes. By 3 o'clock that same afternoon, I had made 9 phone calls. 9 out of my 10 largest clients, accounting for nearly 90% of our total monthly revenue, transferred their freight dispatch contracts directly to my new company without batting an eye. They didn't trust the corporate letterhead. They trusted the guy who picked up the phone at 2 in the morning when a refrigerator unit broke down on the interstate. While I was securing the clients, word was spreading like wildfire back at the staging yard. Around 4 p.m., my cell phone started buzzing non-stop. It was my lead mechanic, Bob. "Art, what on earth is going on over there?" Bob yelled over the sound of impact wrenches in the background. "Dan just walked through the maintenance bay handing out pieces of paper saying we're all getting a 15% pay cut to optimize corporate overhead. He told us if we don't like it, we can pack our tools and clear out." I leaned against my steering wheel and chuckled. "Bob, listen to me closely. I got let go from the LLC today, but I'm opening up shop at the South Yard under Midwest Freight Solutions. Full pay, better health benefits, and 0 corporate clowns telling you how to turn a wrench." "Say no more, boss," Bob said. By 6 o'clock that evening, all 30 of my veteran truck drivers and shop mechanics had walked into Dan's office, dropped their official resignation letters on my old desk, handed over their yard keys, and walked out the front door. They didn't even argue with him. They just signed their new employment contracts with me over coffee at the local diner down the street. Wednesday morning rolled around. It was a crisp, clear 30-degree morning in Milwaukee. Dan walked into his staging facility expecting to see 30 drivers prepping rigs, forklifts, loading pallets, and dispatch radios buzzing with orders. Instead, he walked into complete dead silence. 15 heavy Peterbilt trucks sat completely dormant on the gravel lot, covered in frost. The phones in the front office were ringing off the hook with furious plant managers screaming into voicemail, demanding to know why their morning shipments hadn't arrived at the loading docks. Dan didn't have a commercial driver's license. He didn't know how to operate a dispatch board. He didn't even have the phone numbers for independent owner-operators to fill the empty cabs on short notice. He had taken control of a giant, impressive-looking ship, only to realize he had no crew, no fuel, no map, and 20 feet of freezing water rising in the hold. By Wednesday afternoon, the financial reality of running a commercial trucking company without a single working truck hit Dan right between the eyes. He was sitting in that big leather chair, staring at an empty gravel yard through the window, while the office landline rang every 30 seconds. Every single call was an enraged plant director threatening breach of contract lawsuits because thousands of pounds of perishable cargo were sitting on refrigerated docks across Wisconsin, slowly spoiling. Dan tried to fix it the only way a lazy guy knows how. By throwing money he didn't have at the problem. He spent 4 hours on the phone calling temp agencies and independent freight brokers across 3 states, trying to hire emergency freelance drivers. But here's the funny thing about the logistics industry. Everybody talks. Word had already spread through the local trucking network that the new owners of Midwest Logistics had just tried to screw over 30 veteran drivers and cut their pay. Nobody wanted to touch his yard with a 10-foot pole. The few independent drivers who did answer his calls demanded 3 times the standard industry rate up front, payable in cash before they'd even put a key in the ignition. Dan didn't have the cash. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw my ex-wife's name popping up. I took a slow sip of my coffee, let it ring 3 times, and then picked up. "Art!" Elena screamed into the receiver, her voice completely stripped of that cool corporate composure she'd had 24 hours earlier. "What did you do? None of the drivers showed up today. Bob and his client managers are saying they transferred all their shipping manifests to your new entity. You stole our entire staff and our clients." I leaned back in my office chair at my new Southside terminal, listening to her hyperventilate. "Elena," I said, keeping my voice as calm as a Sunday morning, "I didn't steal a single thing. Your brother walked into the maintenance bay yesterday and told 30 hard-working men that their labor was worth 15% less because he wanted to optimize overhead. They quit on their own accord. And as for the clients, they called me. In this business, people do business with a person, not a piece of paper. This is illegal," she shrieked. "We own 51% of this business. We are going to sue you for everything you have. We're taking you to court for tortious interference." "Elena," I chuckled softly. "You wanted the LLC. You got it. You own every single piece of paper, every single fleet lease, and every single rent agreement attached to that name. In about 2 weeks, your $35,000 monthly truck lease payment is due, along with $15,000 for the yard rent. I suggest you and Dan start driving those rigs yourselves if you want to make payroll. Have a great afternoon." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. What Dan and Elena completely failed to realize in their rush to steal my company was how commercial banking actually works in the state of Wisconsin. When they filed the corporate paperwork to transfer majority ownership of Midwest Logistics LLC into Dan's name, the commercial lending bank required new personal liability guarantees for the fleet leases. They didn't care about family drama. They just wanted warm bodies with credit scores attached to the line of credit. Both Dan and Elena, completely blinded by the fantasy of playing big-shot executives, signed those personal guarantee documents without even consulting a lawyer. 2 weeks went by. The staging yard at Midwest Logistics LLC remained completely silent. All 15 leased Peterbilt trucks sat idle under a fresh layer of gray winter slush. Without a single dollar of freight revenue coming in from the clients I had secured, the LLC missed its very first monthly lease payment of $35,000. 5 days later, they defaulted on the property lease for the staging facility. Commercial fleet lenders don't send polite reminder emails. The moment that 30-day default window slammed shut, 3 massive heavy-duty tow trucks pulled up to the gates of Dan's empty yard under the cover of dusk. The repo crew cut the chain on the main gate, hooked up every single semi-truck and refrigerated trailer on the property, and towed them off to the bank's liquidation yard. Dan stood out on the frozen gravel in his designer coat, holding his lukewarm coffee, watching 50% of his stolen empire get dragged down the road by tow trucks. He tried to argue with the repo driver, but the guy just handed him a legal notice of repossession, climbed into his cab, and drove away into the snow. A week after that, the real hammer dropped. Because Dan and Elena had signed absolute personal guarantees for the corporate debt, the bank bypassed the bankrupt LLC entirely and went straight after their personal assets. The total deficiency judgment for broken lease agreements, unfulfilled shipping contracts, and liquidated damages added up to a staggering $180,000. When a bank comes after you for $180,000 on a personal guarantee, they don't send polite collection letters with smiley faces. They send process servers right to your front door at 6 in the morning. Elena showed up at my new Southside operational hub 2 days later, looking like she'd been dragged through a hedge backward. Gone was the crisp designer coat, the flawless hair, and that cold, detached corporate look she'd pulled on me when she handed me that pink folder. She looked completely exhausted, her eyes bloodshot, clutching a thick stack of legal summonses in her trembling hands. She walked straight into my new private office without knocking. "Art, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. "The bank is freezing our personal accounts. They put a lien on Dan's car and they're threatening to place a legal claim on our house. You have to fix this misunderstanding with the lender right now." I sat back in my chair, took a slow sip of black coffee, and stared at her. "A misunderstanding?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Elena, what misunderstanding? You and your brother tricked me into signing away my company at 2 in the morning. You handed me a pink folder, told me my services were no longer required, and gave me until 1 o'clock to pack my stuff and clear out. You said business requires toughness, remember?" She burst into tears, big dramatic sob stories about how we were family, how we'd been married for 15 years, and how I couldn't just stand by and watch her and her brother get thrown out into the street. She actually tried to convince me that it was my moral duty as a man to take over the bankrupt LLC's bank debts and merge them into my new, thriving firm just to bail them out. "Elena, listen to me very carefully," I said, leaning forward across the desk and looking her dead in the eye. "You made your bed with your deadbeat brother because you thought you could live like royalty off my hard work without doing any of the heavy lifting. You wanted to play big boss. Well, congratulations. You're the boss now. The debts are yours, the leases are yours, and the court summonses are yours. Get out of my office before I call security to escort you off the property." She stared at me like she couldn't believe I was saying those words, then turned around, slammed the door so hard the glass rattled, and stormed out into the rain. 3 weeks later, the divorce proceedings kicked off in full force. Elena's high-priced family lawyer tried to play dirty right out of the gate. He filed a motion in civil court claiming that my new booming company, Midwest Freight Solutions, was actually a derivative asset that had been illegally diverted from the original marital estate. They tried to demand a 50% equity stake in my new firm, plus massive monthly alimony payments to support her lifestyle. My legal team came into that courtroom ready for absolute war. We brought 3 cardboard boxes packed to the brim with ironclad evidence. We presented bank statements, dispatch schedules, maintenance logs, and sworn written affidavits from 28 different truck drivers, mechanics, and 12 major client logistics managers. Every single witness statement said the exact same thing. Midwest Logistics LLC didn't fail because I stole anything. It failed because the new majority owners were completely incompetent, slashed worker pay, missed critical freight deliveries, and drove the entire client base away within 48 hours of taking control. On top of that, my lawyer produced the original property records proving that I had purchased our residential home 5 years before we ever got married, using my own personal inheritance money from my grandfather. The judge, a tough, no-nonsense guy who looked like he'd seen every trick in the book, didn't take long to make his decision. He looked over the evidence, glared down over his reading glasses at Elena and her lawyer, and practically tore their arguments to shreds right there in open court. He ruled that my new company, was a completely separate, legally independent business created entirely with my own personal capital. He declared the residential property non-marital, meaning Elena had zero rights to the house. And to top it all off, because her attempt to sue my new firm was deemed frivolous and based on false claims, the judge ordered her to pay my full legal expenses for the trial. When the judge brought down his gavel, Elena collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands. She walked away from that courtroom with zero equity in my business, no rights to my house, a mountain of legal fees, and a 50% personal responsibility for a bankrupt LLC that owed almost $200,000 to commercial lenders. If you've ever wondered what happens when two people who ran on pure arrogance hit the wall of total financial debt, let me tell you, it isn't pretty. Once the divorce decree was signed and sealed by the court, the bank's collections department moved in like a pack of hungry wolves. Dan had to face the music first. Because he had zero real assets to his name and owed almost $90,000 on his share of the personal fleet guarantees, he was forced to file for Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy. His credit score plummeted straight into the low 400s, effectively nuking his financial life into the Stone Age for the next decade. He couldn't get approved for a credit card, he couldn't take out a loan for a used car, and no landlord in the state of Wisconsin would sign a residential lease with him without a massive cash deposit up front. The $300 designer boots he used to prop up on my mahogany desk? He had to sell them on eBay just to cover his groceries for the month. Elena didn't fare much better. Since she actually had a steady white-collar job as a mid-level claims clerk for a local auto insurance office, the bank couldn't just write off her share of the debt through bankruptcy quite so easily. The court ordered a wage garnishment, taking 25% directly out of her paycheck every 2 weeks before she even saw a dime of it. She had to move out of our suburban home, sell her luxury sedan, and rent a tiny, drafty one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of Milwaukee, right next to the railroad tracks. Meanwhile, back at Midwest Freight Solutions, we were bursting at the seams with new business. By the spring of that year, my 30 drivers were pulling 45 heavy rigs across 5 different states. I rented a brand-new, state-of-the-art distribution hub right off Interstate 94, complete with a heated 10-bay maintenance garage, a digital dispatch command center, and a cozy break room for the guys stocked with fresh coffee and free snacks. My head mechanic, Bob, came into my new office one morning holding 2 mugs of hot coffee. He dropped one on my desk, pulled up a chair, and grinned. "Art, you hear through the grapevine what happened to our old friend Dan?" I looked up from my dispatch monitor. "No idea, Bob. Last I heard he was living on his buddy's couch. What's he up to now?" "He got a job over at the cross-dock yard on the north side," Bob said, taking a sip. "Not as a manager, mind you. Not even as a dispatcher. They got him pushing a rusted pallet jack on the loading ramp for $12 an hour, moving heavy wooden crates of frozen fish in the cold." I couldn't help but shake my head and chuckle. The guy who spent his whole life looking down on honest physical labor, the guy who called my yard crew uneducated blue-collar workers, was now doing the hardest, coldest, dirtiest job in the entire logistics chain just to pay his rent. Karma doesn't just catch up with you in this business. It picks up a sledgehammer and goes to work. A couple of months later, I was driving my black Ford F-150 through that exact same northern industrial park to inspect a line of used refrigerated trailers I was thinking about adding to our fleet. The weather was classic Wisconsin spring, a nasty mixture of freezing rain, gray slush, and biting wind that goes right through your jacket. As I pulled up to the stoplight right across from the cross-dock loading bays, I saw a lone figure in a high-visibility orange vest pushing a heavy pallet jack loaded with wet cardboard boxes through a puddle of dirty slush. His shoulders were hunched, his hands were red and raw from the cold, and his worn-out work boots were completely soaked through. It was Dan. He paused for a second to catch his breath, wiping cold rain off his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket, and happened to look up right as my truck idled at the curb. Our eyes met through my rain-streaked side window. There was no smug smile on his face anymore. No arrogant look, no fancy scotch, no talk about being a co-owner. He just looked at me with pure, unadulterated embarrassment and exhaustion. He looked like a man who finally realized that a fancy title on a piece of paper doesn't mean a thing if you don't have the grit to back it up. I didn't honk my horn, I didn't roll down my window to talk trash or make a scene. I just gave him a simple, quiet nod, stepped on the gas pedal, and pulled away into the rain. Seeing Dan standing in that freezing slush, soaked to the bone and clutching the handles of a rusted pallet jack, didn't make me feel like celebrating. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't feeling sorry for him either. It was just a cold, hard reminder of how fast life puts you in your place when you try to build a life on shortcuts and backstabbing. The guy had every opportunity handed to him on a silver platter. I gave him a warm room, paid his doctors, and handed him a second chance at life when he couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet. But instead of putting in the work, he thought he could just steal the wheel and play captain. Well, now he was down in the engine room shoveling coal in the dark, and nobody was coming to rescue him. By the time summer rolled around, Midwest Freight Solutions was firing on all cylinders. We had expanded our routes all the way down through Indiana and Ohio, hauling everything from fresh dairy to industrial machine parts. My drivers were making top-tier money, taking home great performance bonuses, and every single one of our 32 semi-trucks was running smooth as butter. But if there's one thing I've learned in 45 years on this earth, it's that when things are going almost too well, you better keep your eyes on the rearview mirror. It was a hot Thursday afternoon in July when my office landline rang. My receptionist, Sarah, transferred the call over to my desk, her voice sounding a little hesitant. "Art, I've got a guy on line 2 claiming he's from the Wisconsin State Department of Transportation. He says it's an urgent regulatory matter regarding fleet compliance." I picked up the receiver, pressing it to my ear. "This is Art. How can I help you?" "Mr. Miller," a strict, official-sounding voice replied on the line. "My name is Officer Vance with the DOT Motor Carrier Safety Division. We've received a series of severe, formal complaints filed against your registered carrier number over the past 48 hours. The reports detail multiple instances of falsified driver electronic logbooks, bypassed weigh stations, and severe mechanical brake line failures across your fleet." I sat back in my chair, narrowing my eyes. "Officer, I've been running freight in this state for 12 years. My mechanics service every single rig every 3,000 miles, and our digital logbooks are audited weekly by an independent safety firm. Whoever gave you that information is lying through their teeth." "Be that as it may, Mr. Miller," Vance said coldly. "When a detailed report like this is filed with specific rig numbers and terminal addresses, state protocol requires an immediate, unannounced full-scale field audit. My inspection team will be arriving at your main staging facility tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. I suggest you have every logbook, maintenance record, and driver file pulled and ready on your desk." The moment the line went dead, I set the receiver down and leaned back, tapping my fingers on the desk. Rigs with broken brake lines, falsified logbooks, specific terminal addresses. There were only 2 people in the entire state of Wisconsin who hated my guts enough to file a fake federal report, and only one of them had ever worked inside my old office long enough to know how a carrier safety file was structured. I picked up my cell phone and dialed my head mechanic, Bob, down in the maintenance bay. "Bob," I said, keeping my voice steady, "get the guys together. We've got a full DOT safety inspection squad pulling up to the gates at 7 tomorrow morning." Bob paused, the heavy clatter of a pneumatic wrench dying down in the background. "A full audit? Art, what are they looking for? Our rigs are cleaner than a showroom floor." "Somebody filed a fake safety complaint," I said with a dark chuckle. "Somebody thinks they can use the state inspectors to shut our yard down for 3 days and mess up our delivery schedules. So I want every single truck lined up in the bay, every maintenance folder printed out, and every driver's drug test sheet stamped and stacked by 6:30 a.m. We're going to give these inspectors the cleanest audit they've ever seen in their entire careers." Friday morning hit Milwaukee with a sticky 80-degree summer heat that made the asphalt in the staging yard smell like hot tar. At 6:45 sharp, 3 white state inspection cruisers pulled through our main gates, their flashing yellow lights painting the side of our warehouse. 4 DOT inspectors stepped out, wearing heavy utility belts, clipboards in hand, looking like they were ready to bust a major criminal syndicate. The lead inspector, a tall guy with a thick mustache and a badge that read Vance, walked straight into my front office without missing a step. He didn't offer a handshake. He just tapped his clipboard on my desk and said, "Mr. Miller, we're locking down your dispatch board for the duration of this audit. No trucks leave this yard until every brake drum, tire tread, and digital logbook is verified." "Officer Vance," I said, standing up and gesturing toward the wall of filing cabinets behind me. "Welcome to Midwest Freight Solutions. Everything you requested is printed, cataloged, and organized by truck unit number. My head mechanic is waiting for your team in Bay 1, and every driver currently on site has their commercial license and medical card sitting on the conference table." Vance blinked, clearly caught off guard by how calm I was. Usually, when DOT inspectors show up for a surprise raid, carrier managers start sweating through their shirts and stammering excuses about lost paperwork. But I had nothing to hide. Every single rig in my 32-truck fleet was maintained to factory specifications because I know what happens when a 60,000-pound semi loses its brakes on an icy highway. You don't play games with safety in this business. For 6 grueling hours, Vance's team tore my facility apart. They crawled under trailers with creepers, measured brake pad thickness with digital calipers, checked steering play, plugged diagnostic computers into every engine control module, and cross-referenced 3 years of electronic logging device records against fuel receipts and toll plaza timestamps. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the inspectors walked back into my office. Vance was wiping sweat off his forehead with a blue handkerchief, looking thoroughly exhausted and more than a little annoyed. "Well, Mr. Miller," Vance said, setting his clipboard down on my desk with a heavy sigh. "I've been doing commercial fleet inspections for 18 years, and I've never seen a paper trail or a shop this clean. Your fleet compliance rating is 99.8%. You're fully cleared." "Glad to hear it, officer," I said, pouring him a cup of cold water from the cooler. "Now, if you don't mind me asking, who filed that detailed complaint that wasted 6 hours of your team's time today?" Vance took a long sip of water, looked around the room, and leaned in a little closer. "Protocol says caller tips remain confidential, Mr. Miller. But I'll tell you this much. The guy who called the hotline was hyperventilating, sounded completely desperate, and kept insisting we check the records for Midwest Logistics, a company name that doesn't even match your active corporate entity. He even gave us an old yard address that's been abandoned for 6 months. I leaned back in my chair and let out a dry laugh. Dan. The idiot was so clueless about the business he tried to steal that he didn't even realize my new firm operated under a completely different corporate name, DOT carrier number, and physical terminal address. He had called in a strike against his own defunct bankrupt company's ghost records. "Officer Vance," I said, pulling my smartphone out of my pocket. "Before you head out, I think there's something you ought to listen to." I tapped the screen and played the recorded voicemail Dan had left on my phone 6 months earlier, the drunken rant where he explicitly threatened to file false DOT reports, ruin my business, and make sure I paid for his life. Vance listened to the entire 3-minute recording in dead silence, his thick mustache twitching with growing irritation. When the recording finished, he grabbed his pen, scribbled down the phone number from my screen, and glared at his clipboard. "Filing a fraudulent federal transportation safety report is a Class A misdemeanor, Mr. Miller," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. "It carries a mandatory fine and up to a year in county jail for wasting state law enforcement resources. We don't take kindly to being used as a personal weapon in family feuds." 2 weeks after Officer Vance walked out of my office with that phone recording, the state troopers paid a visit to the cross-dock yard where Dan was pushing pallets. They didn't make a big scene, but they didn't have to. They served him with a formal criminal summons for filing a fraudulent federal emergency report and wasting state law enforcement resources. On top of his Chapter 7 bankruptcy, his destroyed credit, and his minimum wage pallet job, Dan was now facing $3,000 in court fines and a mandatory 6-month probation period. The dummy had tried to drop a boulder on my head, but because he didn't even understand basic corporate registration or DOT carrier numbers, he ended up dropping it straight onto his own foot. While Dan was busy dealing with the county prosecutor, my ex-wife Elena decided to make one last desperate move of her own. She realized that her entry-level salary at the auto insurance firm was barely enough to keep the lights on after the court-ordered wage garnishment took its cut for the bankrupt LLC debt. So she hired a low-rent civil lawyer from a strip mall firm and tried to sue me personally for marital asset diversion and emotional distress. She actually had the nerve to demand that I pay off her portion of the bank debt and hand over a monthly spousal support check so she could move out of her drafty one-bedroom apartment. Her lawyer sent my legal team a formal letter threatening a long, drawn-out trial that would drag my company's name through the mud in the local papers if I didn't settle out of court for a lump sum of $75,000. My corporate lawyer, Tom, called me into his office the afternoon we received the demand letter. He handed me the paper, leaned back in his leather chair and asked, "So, Art, how do you want to handle this? We can offer her $5,000 just to make her go away, or we can go to war." I picked up the letter, read through the ridiculous claims, and tossed it right into the trash can next to Tom's desk. "Tom," I said, "I paid for her brother's medical bills for 2 years. I put a roof over her head for 15 years. She tried to steal my life's work at 2 in the morning while I was sleep-deprived. I'm not giving her a single copper penny. Let's go to court." 3 months later, we stood in front of a county civil court judge. Elena's lawyer stood up and spent 20 minutes putting on a dramatic show, trying to paint me as a cold-hearted husband who abandoned his wife and stole her family business the moment things got tough. He used fancy words, waved a bunch of useless papers around, and tried to make it sound like Elena was the real victim of the whole story. When it was my turn, Tom didn't yell or make a big speech. He just stood up, opened his briefcase, and handed the judge 3 neat stapled documents. The first document was the bank paper showing that I bought my house before I ever met Elena. The second document was the paper trail proving she voluntarily transferred the LLC ownership to Dan while hiding the company's lease liabilities. And the third document was a sworn affidavit from her own former accountant, testifying that Elena had personally authorized the transfer of corporate funds to pay for Dan's personal credit card bills. The judge looked over the papers for about 2 minutes. Then, he put his glasses down, looked straight at Elena's lawyer and said, "Counselor, your client signed personal guarantee documents with a commercial bank, attempted to strip her husband of his business without legal counsel, and is now asking this court to bail her out of her own financial incompetence. This lawsuit is not only completely devoid of merit, it borders on abuse of the judicial system." The judge slammed his gavel down so hard it echoed through the entire room. He dismissed her lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she could never file it again, and ordered her to pay every single dollar of my attorney fees for making us show up to court. When we walked out of that courtroom into the afternoon sunshine, Elena was sitting on a wooden bench in the hallway, staring at the floor with tears running down her face. She had spent her last remaining savings on a cheap lawyer, only to end up owing me $4,000 for my legal bills on top of everything else. I stopped for a second, looked at her, and realized I didn't feel an ounce of anger anymore. No hatred, no bitterness, no desire to gloat. Just pure, clean indifference. She had made her choices, traded a good man and a good life for a cheap shortcut with her deadbeat brother, and now the bill had finally come due. A year and a half after that final day in court, the dust had completely settled. Midwest Freight Solutions was no longer just a local haulage firm surviving in the suburbs. We had turned into one of the most reliable regional carriers in the entire state of Wisconsin. We had 42 shiny semi-trucks on the road, 55 full-time employees, and a brand-new modern distribution hub with a heated garage and a yard big enough to park a fleet twice our size. My drivers were taking home some of the highest paychecks in the Midwest. Our client retention rate was sitting at a solid 100%, and every single person on my payroll knew that as long as they put in an honest day's work, I had their back through thick and thin. There were no parasitic relatives walking through the maintenance bays in $300 boots, no secret folders hidden in pink paper, and no fake titles, Every single guy on my team earned his keep, from the dispatchers handling the night shift to the junior mechanics sweeping up grease off the shop floor. As for Dan and Elena, life has a funny way of balancing the ledger without you ever having to lift a finger. Dan finished his probation period for that fake DOT complaint, but his reputation in the local logistics community was completely shot. In the trucking world, word travels fast, and nobody wants a guy on their property who calls in false federal reports when he gets mad. He got let go from that cross-dock facility on the north side after getting into an argument with his supervisor over weekend shifts. Last I heard from one of my drivers, he was working part-time pulling night shifts at a gas station off the highway, living in a small rented room above a laundromat, and driving a beat-up 20-year-old hatchback with a rusted muffler. The guy who wanted to play big corporate boss couldn't even keep a basic shift job because he never learned the one thing that actually keeps a man grounded: humility. Elena is still working as an entry-level clerk at that auto insurance firm. Her wage garnishment for the old LLC's bank debts is slated to continue for another 4 years, taking a quarter of her income before she even sees her paycheck. She still lives in that small, noisy one-bedroom apartment right next to the railroad tracks on the edge of town. Ride in the city bus to work every morning because she couldn't afford the insurance payments on a decent car. She tried calling my phone once about 6 months ago late on a Sunday night. I didn't answer. I didn't block the number either. I just let it ring until it stopped, set my phone face down on the nightstand, and went right back to sleep. Some doors are meant to stay closed forever. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in late November when the first real snowstorm of the winter rolled in over Lake Michigan. The wind was howling across the staging yard, blowing gray slush against the office windows, and the thermometer near the main bay door was dropping fast toward single digits. I put on my heavy work jacket, walked out onto the concrete loading ramp, and looked down the line. All 10 bay doors were open, humming with activity. Forklifts were moving back and forth, loading pallets of local Wisconsin cheese and frozen meats onto our refrigerated trailers. Engine block heaters were plugged in, diesel motors were idling smoothly in the crisp air, and my drivers were double-checking their tire chains and trailer locks for the night run down to Chicago. My head mechanic, Bob, walked up the ramp steps, blowing on his hands to keep warm, clutching 2 big insulated thermoses of steaming hot black coffee. He handed one over to me with a grin. "Heavy snow coming down fast out there on Interstate 94, Art," Bob said, looking out at the whiteout conditions starting to build beyond the security gates. "You think the guys are going to run into trouble on the highway tonight?" I took a long, hot sip of the coffee, felt the heat spread right down to my boots, and watched the bright red LED taillights of my lead truck roll smoothly out through the gates, hitting its turn signal toward the highway ramp. I looked at Bob, clapped him on the shoulder, and smiled. "The roads are just fine, Bob," I said. "When you've got real, honest people in the cab, good machinery under the hood, and zero dead weight pulling you down from the passenger seat, a little winter snow isn't ever going to stop us." And that, my friends, is the whole story. If there's one lesson to take away from all this chaos, it's simple. Always read the fine print before you sign anything, never hand the wheel over to someone who hasn't put in the work, and remember that real respect is earned on the ground, not printed on a business card. Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed this story, drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and leave a comment down below with your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe out there on the road, hold on to your keys, and keep rolling.